The theory of the golden billion. It was coined back in the early 1990s. This was at the time that the Soviet Union was at the cusp of collapse. The term was first used by a Russian named Anatoly K. Sukhinov. This was in a book called The Plot of World Government, Russia and the Golden Billion. Now, this is a book that this gentleman wrote in 1990 under a pseudonym A. Kuzmich. The book described a doomsday scenario in which powerful Western nations, who are deeply fearful of overpopulation, ecological change, and of course the lack of sufficient resources, would seek to extend control over the rest of the world. Now, they would ensure this by colonizing resources of other countries, particularly poorer countries, and also countries that are resource rich. The idea of the golden billion, at least the theory, that's what it propagates, is that this elite, this global elite, will ensure that the world is habitable only to 1 billion of their own people. The remaining 5 or 6 or 7 billion will find it extremely difficult to live, or they will be living in relative poverty or relatively modest means. Now, the theory of golden billion has great emphasis and importance for Russia in particular, because according to this theory, Russia would be at the receiving end of what is a Western-led plan. And the reason for that is because Russia has a huge reservoir of natural resources, it's got a large landmass, and these would be critical assets that would be necessary for the survival of this billion elite. Now, Mr. Kuzmich's ideas were popularized by anti-Western and anti-globalization Soviet-era intellectual Sergei Kara-Murz. In fact, in an article written in 1999, Kara-Murz argued that while the elites in these rich Western countries do not refer to themselves as golden billion, the theory actually emerged from a combination of two major Western ideas. One, that of a golden age of prosperity, and two, the view that the world's limited resources will not be able to sustain the entire population. In fact, Kara-Murz went on to argue that the golden billion had come to connote, in practical terms, the population of high-income OECD countries that have higher levels of per capita consumption, that are better off economically and politically than the rest of the world, and most importantly, they exert an outsized influence on the rest of the world. On Crux Decode, why has this theory now been pulled out 30 years after its coinage? Why is someone as important as Vladimir Putin using this theory to justify the continued war in Ukraine? As the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its 6th month, President Vladimir Putin last week invoked this decades-old conspiracy theory called the Golden Billion. Putin said in Moscow on July 20th,
Модель тотального доминирования так называемого «золотого миллиарда» несправедлива. Ну почему вот этот золотой миллиард из всего населения планеты, почему он должен доминировать над всеми, навязывать свои правила поведения, основанные на иллюзии исключительность? Она делит народы на первый и второй сорт, а потому является российской и неоколониальной по сути своей. А лежащая в ее основе глобалистская, якобы либеральная идеология все больше приобретает черты тоталитаризма.
He also went on to say that the golden billion were able to achieve global dominance to a large extent by robbing other people, particularly people in Asia and in Africa. Now, this theory of the so-called golden billion, it's called Zolotoy Miliard in Russian. It's been around for the last 30 years. It basically accuses wealthy Western elites of having amassed wealth by exploiting the rest of the world. It is, as Putin said, a neo-colonial concept. Not just that, it also accuses this Western elite of seeking to perpetuate their total control over the rather limited resources that planet Earth has. In fact, if you go back to 2019, there was a book by Elliot Borenstein, a professor of Russian studies at the New York University. The book says that the golden billion gathers together many of the most important tropes of benighted post-Soviet Russia. That is the need to defend the country's natural resources. You have a rapacious West, which is always out to get Russia. the West demoralizing Russia's youth in particular. If you remember the pro-democracy protests that happened in the first decade of the 2000s, the destruction of Russia's economy, whether it's through control of oil or other natural resources, and of course, most importantly, the destruction of public health. Now, all of these different strands come together into one compelling narrative as per this golden billion theory. Now, Borenstein further went on to write in this theory that it has now become a staple of contemporary Russian conspiracy theories. In fact, it's there in his book as The Plots Against Russia, Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism. In fact, Vladimir Putin himself invoked this theory before as well. It's not the first time that he's talked about the golden billion. In fact, back in 2002, in a book called First Person, an astonishingly frank self-portrait by Russia's President Vladimir Putin, and in that book, he says that only a small number of states populated by the so-called golden billion have been able to achieve economic and scientific progress in the past 2 to 3 decades. After the West sanctioned Russia for invading Ukraine, Russian officials have sought to use this theory of golden billion as proof that the Western elite is still singularly focused in its agenda of trying to isolate Moscow. In fact, it's not just Putin. Nikolai Patrushev, who's the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, a very powerful man, in fact, a man that many say could likely be Putin's successor, he said this as well a few days ago, and I quote, "While hiding their actions behind human rights, freedom, and democracy, they push ahead with the golden billion doctrine, which implies that only a select few are entitled to prosperity in this world." In fact, the Washington Post had a report which quoted from an interview that Patrushev had given to the state-owned Russian-language publication Argumenti I Fakti. In that article, in that interview, Patrushev suggested that the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, could have been orchestrated by the West in pursuit of its golden billion project. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because there is now recorded scientific evidence, whether it's from the WHO or from other science journals, that COVID-19 in fact originated in a wet market in Wuhan in China. Not exactly coming from the Western elite, as it were. And more importantly, there have been as many, if not more people in the West who have died than who have died either in Russia or in China for that matter. But in conclusion, Xenia Charkayev, who's an anthropologist at the HSE University in Russia, said in a paper earlier this year, "The golden billion, Russia, COVID, murderous global elites." In that particular paper, this theory is becoming increasingly commonsensical in modern-day Russia. In fact, Charkayev pointed out that the golden billion is not only used to criticizing the West as well as the Kremlin, it is considered by some as the Russian elite too are getting to be controlled by this. All in all, it shows how one theory, howsoever unfounded it may be, howsoever conspiratorial it may be, has become a compelling narrative to continue justification of what is patently an illegal and immoral war.